Welcome to the debate. There is a very specific type of modern psychological torture that we all just sort of accept as completely normal,
Oh, absolutely.
right? Imagine your boss says something just, offhand to you in a Tuesday morning meeting. It's not a catastrophe, it's not a firing offense, it's just wrong. A slight criticism, maybe an unfair assessment of a project you just poured your soul into for the last 3 weeks. And for the rest of the day, that one passing comment just replays in your mind. It loops infinitely, exactly like a pop song you absolutely hate but somehow cannot get out of your head.
Yeah, and you end up taking it home with you. I mean, you are physically sitting at the dinner table with your family, but mentally, you are still sitting in conference room B.
Yes, exactly.
You are relitigating the entire conversation, coming up with all the perfect, devastating responses you didn't say in the moment. It completely hijacks your evening.
Precisely. You are letting someone else live rent-free in your head. So today, we are debating a 2,000-year-old framework built specifically to a victim. The Stoics didn't just sit around writing abstract philosophy. They created a practical psychological survival guide. But the question we're wrestling with today is this. Does applying ancient Stoicism in a modern, high-stress corporate office actually make you bulletproof, or does it just turn you into an unfeeling, detached robot?
Right, because on one hand, Stoicism promises a way to stop being a passenger in your own life. But on the other hand, its core mandate to radically separate yourself from outcomes and emotional reactions risks, well, completely flatlining your natural empathy. And in a collaborative, high-pressure environment, that empathy is precisely what keeps teams from falling apart.
I mean, my stance is clear. Stoicism is the ultimate tool for reclaiming your agency, allowing you to respond with intention rather than just blind anger or panic.
And I argue that artificially separating ourselves from our emotional judgments, treating interpersonal friction as just quote-unquote obstacles, promotes this unnatural detachment that actively suppresses essential human responsiveness.
Let's look at how people actually behave when things go wrong at work, because we usually default to one of two highly destructive paths. The first is exploding outward. We vent, we blame, we spiral into every Slack channel and break room conversation we can find.
The classic workplace gossip spiral.
Exactly. Biologically, venting gives us a quick dopamine hit. It feels like we're doing something when really we're just looking for validation that the world is cruel and our boss is terrible.
Or we do the exact opposite. We implode. We go totally quiet, we let the frustration settle in our chest like a stone, and we pretend everything is fine. And we know the science on this now. Bottling that up just floods your system with cortisol. Honestly, I've done both, and both are completely exhausting for the nervous system. I think we agree on the diagnosis of the problem here.
We do. Neither lashing out nor bottling up actually solves the underlying issue. I'm arguing that Stoicism offers a legitimate third option, which is actual empowerment. By relying on what the Greek philosopher Epictetus called the dichotomy of control, focusing strictly on our own thoughts, choices, and effort, we free ourselves from agonizing over uncontrollable outcomes. Right, but things like the macroeconomy or supply chain issues or, crucially, other people's opinions. We stop spending energy on the outcome and we pour entirely into the effort.
And that sounds fantastic in theory, but I am arguing that the Stoic cure might actually be worse than the disease when you drag it into complex social environments. The modern workplace is a team sport. You can't just operate as an island. Stoicism demands a level of detachment, treating interpersonal conflict merely as obstacles or, observing your own emotions like you're watching a movie, that actively suppresses the essential human responsiveness you need to navigate real relationships.
Okay, but let's ground this right away in the reality of who Epictetus actually was, because the context really matters here. He wasn't some wealthy aristocrat philosophizing from a marble palace. He was a former slave.
Right.
If anyone had the absolute right to be bitter, to explode at the systemic unfairness of his reality, it was him. He lived at the absolute bottom of a brutal hierarchy. But he realized that holding on to anger over things he couldn't change cost him everything and gave him nothing. So he split the world in two, things that are up to us and things that are not.
The effort versus the outcome.
Exactly. Your effort, your values, your choices, your integrity, those are up to you. The outcome, whether the client signs the contract, whether your team agrees with your pitch, whether the economy crashes, is not.
I come at it from a different way. Let's transpose that extreme survival tactic into a modern collaborative environment. In a company, other people's opinions and the final outcomes absolutely do matter. They are literally the metrics by which collaboration succeeds or fails. A business isn't a monastery.
Nobody is saying it is.
But think about it. If you pitch a project and the team shoots it down, a strict Stoic might say, well, my effort was good, their opinion is outside my control, I release it. But in doing so, you bypass the necessary vulnerability of asking, why didn't this resonate? Did I miss something? How does my team actually feel about this? You disconnect from the impact you have on your colleagues.
Wait, I think you're conflating releasing the outcome with apathy toward the outcome. The Stoics never said the outcome doesn't matter. They were highly effective people, lawyers, merchants, emperors. They said the outcome isn't in your absolute control. So spending your finite mental energy agonizing over it is completely irrational.
But we aren't purely rational creatures.
Right, which is why they designed this practice. Think about the source materials analogy of lying awake at 3 in the morning. Your mind is racing, you're sweating over a potential restructuring announcement at your company. Your brain is trying to simulate future scenarios to protect you, but it's essentially a cognitive glitch. Does worrying about your boss's opinion at 3 a.m. actually solve the problem, or does asking what action is available to me in this moment provide the only real solution?
Pragmatically, no. At 3 a.m., the only logical move is to try to sleep. But human psychology isn't a light switch. You can't just logically deduce your way out of anxiety.
But you can redirect it. That's the mechanism of the dichotomy of control. When the anxiety hits, the Stoic practice is to actively interrupt the spiral by asking one very specific question. What action is available to me in this exact moment? At 3 a.m., the only action available is sleep. If it's 3 p.m. and you're worried about the restructuring, the action available might be updating your resume. It forces the brain to drop the rope on the things it cannot move and grip the things it can.
You say drop the rope, but anxiety exists because you are a social creature whose livelihood depends on that restructuring. To tell an employee stop spending energy on the outcome ignores the fact that their mortgage depends on the outcome. Their children's health care depends on the outcome.
Yes, but
The effort belongs to you, yes, but the outcome dictates your reality. And when you train yourself to constantly sever your emotional attachment to the outcome, you inherently train yourself to care less about the people and the systems that govern those outcomes. You build a wall. You stop being invested in the collective struggle because it's, quote-unquote, outside your control.
it's not a wall, though. It's a boundary. Think about how a sales pitch actually works. You can prepare perfectly, deliver a flawless presentation, have the best product on the market, and still lose the deal because the client's cousin works for your competitor.
Sure.
You can also completely fumble the pitch and somehow win the contract. That is just the chaotic reality of business. Acknowledging that doesn't make you less engaged. It makes you resilient enough to show up the next day and put the effort in again, without tying your entire self-worth to a spreadsheet.
But the spreadsheet is the reality of the business, and releasing the outcome doesn't magically make the workplace a utopia. You still have to deal with the project failing or the boss yelling. When all your perfectly controlled internal effort still hits a brick wall, how do you keep from breaking?
Well, that brings us to the second pillar, which is how Marcus Aurelius viewed friction. He wrote in his private journal, which, by the way, was never meant for publication. This was just him talking to himself. He wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way."
The famous obstacle is the path concept.
Yes, and it's brilliant because it directly rewires our biological defaults. We are hardwired by evolution to treat obstacles as physical threats. A failing project or a highly critical email triggers the exact same fight-or-flight response in the amygdala as a predator in the wild. Friction is treated as the ultimate enemy. But the Stoics understood that the obstacle isn't a pause in your journey, it is the journey. The moment the boss yells at you isn't the moment your career goes off track. It's the moment the training actually begins. You cannot develop patience without a test of your patience. You cannot develop courage without something to fear.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that.
Let me tell you why. I have a real problem with this application in the modern workplace. Actively welcoming adversity might sound noble, but it is incredibly dangerous when you factor in modern power dynamics.
How so?
Let's say you have a boss who is fundamentally unfair, maybe even toxic, discriminatory, or abusive. If your immediate philosophical reflex is to categorize that toxic boss as just an obstacle to be welcomed, an opportunity to build your Stoic character, you are bypassing the necessary human step of acknowledging the injustice. You are essentially gaslighting yourself, and you are letting a broken, toxic system off the hook.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. We have to be clear about something. Stoicism isn't masochistic. It doesn't advocate for enduring abuse or staying in a toxic environment just to prove how tough you are. It is a cognitive reframing tool designed to prevent us from playing the victim while we fix the problem.
But doesn't it minimize the pain of the problem?
No. Instead of wallowing in, why is this happening to me, you ask, what is this preparing me for? That doesn't mean you don't report the toxic boss to HR. It means you don't let the toxic boss destroy your internal peace while you are drafting the email to HR.
But the very process of asking, what is this preparing me for, immediately forces a reframing that skips over the raw, visceral pain of the moment. And in a team environment, this creates a sterile, deeply isolating culture. It borders on toxic positivity. Imagine a colleague comes to you and says, I was just humiliated in that client meeting. The manager threw me entirely under the bus. They don't need you to tell them, well, the impediment to action advances action. This is your teacher.
Of course not. That would be incredibly obnoxious and totally socially inept.
Exactly, because what they actually need in that moment is validation. They need human empathy. They need you to acknowledge the pain and say, that was completely unfair. Stoicism's rush to utilize the obstacle to immediately extract the lesson and intellectualize the pain actively suppresses the shared empathy that builds trust among colleagues. It turns every painful experience into a solo optimization project rather than a moment for human connection. Empathy requires us to sit in the mud with people, not just point out how the mud is building their character.
Finding utility in pain doesn't erase the existence of the pain, nor does it prevent you from acknowledging someone else's. The Stoics actually had a very precise mechanical understanding of how emotion works, which leads us to the third pillar. They separated what they called the impression from the judgment.
The gap between stimulus and response.
Right. Let's look at the mechanics of this. When that colleague gets humiliated or when a boss insults you, something happens physiologically before you can even think. Your amygdala fires up, your heart rate spikes, your stomach tightens, heat literally rises in your face.
Right, the fight or flight.
That is the impression. It is a biological survival mechanism, and the Stoics never pretended it was in your control. But then, there is a moment, a fraction of a second. The psychologist Viktor Frankl, who survived the absolute horrors of the Nazi concentration camps, noted that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose.
And Frankl's insight is profound. There's no debating that.
I like to think of that space, that gap, like the clutch pedal in a manual transmission car. When your boss insults you, your engine, your raw emotion, your anger, it's revving at 6,000 RPMs. It's screaming. But if you compress the clutch, you temporarily disconnect that roaring engine from the wheels. The engine is still revving. You still feel the intense anger, but the car doesn't launch forward and crash into a wall. You give yourself a moment to safely shift gears, to let the logical prefrontal cortex catch up to the emotional amygdala.
That is a great analogy for preventing a disastrous outburst. I fully agree that we shouldn't crash the car. My issue is with how the Stoic material tells us to use that clutch pedal.
What do you mean?
The practice is explicitly described as learning to watch yourself the way you'd watch a character in a film with curiosity rather than judgment. That isn't just pressing the clutch, that is stepping entirely out of the vehicle. It is dissociation. When you step back to observe your own physiological anger or your own sadness like you're watching a movie, you are pulling yourself out of your own authentic experience.
That's an interesting point. Though I would frame it differently. I wouldn't call it dissociation. I'd call it active observation. The tragic reality is that most of us never find that clutch pedal. We just react. We snap. We send the passive-aggressive Slack message. We say the exact thing we are going to deeply regret an hour later. Pausing to observe the emotion isn't dissociating from the feeling. It's refusing to be enslaved by it.
But look at the interpersonal cost of that constant observation. You're in that gap evaluating your emotional response by asking, is this reaction useful right now? That is a hyper-utilitarian, almost algorithmic metric for human emotion. Emotions aren't supposed to be useful. They're supposed to be felt.
But it works.
Even at work. If you are experiencing a deep professional betrayal, filtering that experience through a lens of, is this aligned with who I am trying to be, intellectualizes something that desperately needs to be processed emotionally. It demands a cinematic distance that erodes genuine human connection. People connect through shared vulnerability, not through the shared observation of their respective physiological impressions.
So what is the alternative then? Unchecked vulnerability, just letting the raw impression dictate your actions? Because that leads straight back to the exploding and imploding we discussed at the very beginning. If my stomach tightens and heat rises in my face because a colleague challenged my idea, and I just let that unintellectualized emotion drive me, I am going to lash out. I am going to damage that relationship far more than if I had taken a breath, observed the anger, and asked, is what I'm about to do actually helpful?
I'm not advocating for lashing out. I mean, I'll admit, I've had moments where I fired off an angry email and immediately wished I could pull the Ethernet cord out of the wall to stop it from sending.
Exactly. We all have.
The gap sounds great in theory, but in practice, the constant policing of that gap, the relentless requirement to step outside of yourself and view your own heat and tightened stomach as mere impressions to be managed, it creates an exhaustion of its own. It creates a workforce of people who are meticulously managing their responses, treating every single human interaction as a philosophical exercise. You lose the spontaneity of human relationship. It's exhausting to constantly monitor yourself like a science experiment.
It is effortful, yes, but I argue it makes the exchange safer and far more intentional. We have to remember the Stoics weren't perfect, unfeeling people. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor who faced plague, war, and immense personal betrayals. Epictetus had a profoundly traumatic past. They were intensely human.
Right.
And that is exactly the point. This philosophy isn't for some enlightened, perfect alien species. It is for humans who are prone to anger, prone to deep anxiety, and who are tired of being pushed around by life.
But being pushed around by life is sometimes just a pejorative way of saying being fundamentally affected by the world. We should be affected by the world. We should be deeply affected by our colleagues, by our failures, and by the friction around us. If we constantly retreat to the citadel of our own internal control, aggressively releasing outcomes and viewing complex social obstacles merely as personal optimization metrics, we might gain internal tranquility. I'll grant you that.
Thank you.
But we lose the shared, messy, empathetic struggle that actually makes a workplace function.
Well, if there's one thing to take away from my side today, it shouldn't be that Stoics are unfeeling robots trying to optimize away their pain. It's that they're individuals actively taking their power back. By recognizing that we cannot control the economy, the delayed flights, or the critical boss, we can establish absolute dominion over our own effort. Embracing obstacles as the very path of our development and finding that crucial clutch pedal between stimulus and response allows us to stop reacting blindly. We choose a life of true intention, not suppression.
And if you take anything from my side, it's a warning about the hidden cost of that intention. While finding a gap before reacting destructively is undeniably useful, the overarching Stoic framework risks creating a sterile, isolated environment. Treating every colleague's reaction as something not up to us and viewing our own emotions from a cinematic distance quietly erodes the raw empathy required to navigate modern challenges together. You might protect your inner peace, but you risk doing it at the expense of your human connections.
It is an incredibly difficult balance. I mean, how do we maintain intentionality without losing our emotional authenticity? These are questions people have been wrestling with for 2 millennia, and the space between stimulus and response remains a massive, deeply fascinating area for all of us to explore further in the text.
Absolutely. The tension between protecting our internal control and maintaining our external connections isn't easily resolved.
So the next time your boss says something that sticks with you, and it starts looping in your mind like that terrible pop song you can't turn off, remember you actually have a choice in how you listen to it and what you do when the music stops. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.